Hello again. I always enjoy looking at things that nobody else has noticed, or more particularly stuff that people don't want to think about. Take riots, for instance. We've seen one or two things that have nearly turned into riots recently in the news. Whenever there's a riot in Britain, politicians always like to throw up their hands in horror and pretend that there's never been anything like it, that this is the worst violence we've ever seen in Britain. Usually they then claim that society is falling apart for various reasons, but I mean, it's all rubbish. Rioting's always been very popular in Britain. I expect we'll see a bit of rioting this summer because the weather's a bit warm, isn't it? And people are feeling a little bit jittery. It's just one of those things. The British do enjoy rioting. Some of the worst riots ever seen in Britain took place 100 years ago in 1919. And since nobody seems to know anything about it these days, I thought I might talk about it a little bit. During the riots in England in 2011, our television screens had lots of pictures of burning buildings on them, and the impression was that nothing like it had been seen before and everything was going to ruin. Because it began in Tottenham, that particular riot, it was suggested that it was a reaction to police racism. But that's not true, really. I mean, young people enjoy burning down buildings and looting shops from time to time to get stuff they can't afford to buy usually. These pictures show Luton Town Hall. I'm sure we all know Luton, nice quiet town. Luton Town Hall burning away, and then the aftermath when it's been burnt out by rioters when the looting had subsided the next morning. This bit of rioting began when a street party turned ugly and troops had to be called in to patrol the streets and stop the people burning down any more buildings and put an end to the looting. We forget sometimes that much of Britain was under martial law in that year, in 1919. We get up really worked up these days if the police have riot shields or if we've got some new vehicle. We think that we're really hard done by. But 100 years ago, tanks, even battleships were used to stop rioters. In August 1919, 3 warships were ordered to Liverpool, where they anchored off the city and trained their guns on Liverpool, threatening to shell the city if the rioting there didn't stop. Here's one of the ships, HMS Valiant. The reason that battleships were called in was because soldiers backed by tanks had already tried to calm things down, but nothing seemed to work. They'd tried bayonet charges, they'd fired at the rioters, killing some of them, but none of it seemed to make any difference. That's why they had to call in the Navy. Here's a few scenes from Liverpool that month, just to give you an idea of what a city can look like when the authorities really take the gloves off and try and deal with rioting. Luckily, it began to rain after a few days. Nothing puts a stop to rioting like rain. Sometimes rain is referred to as the policeman's friend because people usually want to go home. They don't feel like running around throwing petrol bombs and setting fire to things when it's pissing down with rain. It wasn't just tanks and battleships that were deployed to control the rioting that year. In Glasgow, tanks were certainly called in. They were gathered together in the old cattle market near the city centre. But artillery was set up as well, again with the intention to shell the city if the rioting didn't stop. This next picture shows some tanks in the cattle market in Glasgow, ready for action. I find all this very amusing. Today, whenever there's any sort of disorder on the streets, you always have two silly claims being made. On the one hand, people talk about police brutality and accuse them of being heavy-handed. I wonder how these moany people would feel if they found themselves facing bayonet charges, volleys of rifle fire from troops, tanks, warships and artillery. That would give them something to complain about, wouldn't it? On the other side, there are those who say that the crowds have behaved with unprecedented savagery and nothing has ever been seen like this before in this country, which of course is ridiculous. The rioting we're having today is nothing like as bad as the rioting used to be in Britain even a few years ago. By the way, I have, needless to say, written a book on this subject a few years ago.